Welcome to this John F. Wood Center Makerspace Independent Learning tutorial. This tutorial is focused on the Janome embroidery machine's proprietary software, Artistic Digitizer. This software is indispensable for creating and adjusting embroidery files. Artistic Digitizer works from vector-based formats such as SVG files, so we will start in Inkscape today so we can talk about the qualities of the file before they are imported. If you would like a more in-depth explanation of how to create vector files, check out our Inkscape tutorial, linked in the description. In this video, we will be discussing qualities of the vector, opening Digitizer and importing, resizing and repositioning, changing the fabric, stitch types, density and flow, the properties panel, adding text, and exporting our file. We are going to begin this video in Inkscape so we can discuss the different properties of the SVG we want to use to make our embroidery file. I've created these two designs which are very similar to each other. We will discuss the differences between them and what effect that will have on the embroidery. One big difference is that on the left, our border is a ring shape, whereas in the one on the right, I left the border and background as two overlapping circles. When designing an embroidery file, it is often best to remove overlaps. This allows us to select the optimum stitch type for specific areas. The right one, made from two circles, will result in two full circles of stitches, which is one, very densely stitched, and that can cause fabric warping, and two, uses a lot more time and material to complete the embroidery. There are times where overlapping is an intentional choice, but most of the time we are aiming to minimize overlaps at the vector stage. Another difference is that in the design on the left, all of the black is one shape, whereas on the right, I use the pen tool to separate the sleeve part of this design into its own color. That means that in Artistic Digitizer, we can select two different stitch types for these two different areas, even if I still embroider them in the same color. The final big difference is that you can see in the design on the right that I've included the background as a stitched element, while the patch on the left just has an empty space around the coffee cup. The result of that will be that whatever backing fabric we choose for these patches will be the material background in this case. Choices like that can reduce the stitching density and save time and material if you can find the right fabric. Once we are happy with the file, we can save it for use in Artistic Digitizer. You can select Save As from the Inkscape toolbar. You can give it a title and choose a saving destination. On our Makerspace desktops, you can save your files within the desktop folder associated with the current semester and the relevant equipment. You are welcome to create subfolders as you like. Make sure to save in an Inkscape SVG format. Artistic Digitizer can be very grouchy about accepting a plain SVG format. Artistic Digitizer is this software here, with the flower on the blue box background. If you don't see the icon in the dock, it can be found by opening up the applications and searching Artistic Digitizer. When we start the software, it brings us to the home screen. This is where we can see all the properties of our project. These elements can be changed as you work on the file as well. From these thumbnails, you can see some of the designs that other people have drafted recently. You may not use someone else's design without their permission. We'll be creating our own new design today by importing our vector. So let's start a new file. If we select Open, our Finder will pop up and we can seek out the SVG that we just saved. When it opens, Artistic Digitizer will automatically choose a suggested stitch type based on the different qualities of that part of the design. The selection tool is the very first tool in the toolbar, and it can be used to move, resize, or rotate your design. If you want to resize using the selection tool, click and drag these little arrows at the corner of your selected object. You can also visit this info bar here and change the size by entering your preferred measurement in each direction. If you keep this option proportional checked, it will keep the aspect ratio the same. That way, if you change the width, the height will scale accordingly and vice versa. If we click once on the selected shape, it turns these resizing arrows into little rotation arrows. If we now click and drag on those, you can see that the design will pivot and rotate around its center. We can then click on it once again to get our resizing handles back. Let's take another look at the differences between our two designs now that they're in our Artistic Digitizer workspace. You'll notice right away that there is a piece of this orange fill missing. I suspect that's because there happens to be a very tiny overlap. To fix that, we can go to select all of the pieces that might be overlapping, and then over here in the Properties menu, we can find the Remove Overlaps and change that from Auto to Never. You can see it return that missing piece right away. Also, again you can see that our left design, without the stitched background, is showing the backing fabric behind our coffee cup. If we have a specific fabric in mind, we can visualize this more easily if we change the fabric color within the software to something that is similar. In the top bar, if we select Fabric, we can change to whatever color will be closest to what we are working with. Next, we're going to talk about the black area, which makes up the outlines of this coffee cup. On the left design, I left all the black as one entity, and Artistic Digitizer has suggested a satin stitch. You can see that if I switch up the stitch type, it affects the whole black area. I think that the whole thing happens to look best as a step stitch, but we could test it out as a satin for either part. The main three stitching types are satin, step, and running stitch. Satin stitch is going to flow based on the shape of the object. It usually results in a shiny or satiny look compared to the other stitch types. Satin stitch is perfect for a patch style border. You can see on the left design, because the border is a ring shape, we can select satin and see that it sort of flows around the circle with the ring. With the one on the right, the satin will not form a nice border around the design. It tries to fill in the whole circle underneath the top circle. So in my opinion, creating that ring style border around your vector is the superior way of creating a classic style edge to a patch type design. If you're embroidering onto a garment directly, no border may be required, depending on the look you are going for. Next, we will inspect the stitching density. If you select the part of your design and look in the Properties window, we can see the options for our stitching. This is where we will choose our stitch style. The Properties tab should be open upon booting the software, but if it's not visible to you, you can open it by going to View, Toolbars, Properties. Within the Properties tab, there is an option labeled Density. The density is how close the stitches are to each other, how many stitches we are cramming into an area. It is 0.4 millimeters by default, but we can click this little checkbox to manually alter the density. The higher number we enter here, the less stitches there will be. The default is 0.4, so if we do 0.3 for example, you'll see that it'll throw more stitches in there and tighten things up. One thing that you have to keep in mind with density though, is that the more densely we pack the stitches, the more likely the fabric is to warp. Warping can cause pieces of the embroidery to be misaligned, and if it's severe, it can be impossible to iron the fabric back down flat. We're trying to walk the line between making the stitches as densely packed as we can without creating a warping in our fabric. This is one reason why I recommend doing a prototype on some rough scrap fabric before continuing on to your good copy. Issues can be caught in the prototyping stage, so we can refine it for your final version. The next stitch I'll show you is step stitch. In step stitch, all of the stitches flow directionally in one orientation. This stitch is really great for filling in larger areas. For example, this background circle is a great use of step stitch. Anywhere that's sizable and needs to be covered pretty evenly, step stitches are going to be your go-to. Again, we can alter the density of the step stitch. However, step stitch is especially sensitive to the density being too high, and this is where warping is most likely to occur. Before we move on to talking about running stitch, I'll show you this other weird one that I like to use sometimes. It's called stippling. Stippling will create this weird windy shape within the shape that was defined in the file. Again, we can alter the density, and this time it changes how tightly these coils are wound. You can see it leaves this kind of cool organic pattern. Running stitch can only be applied to stroke lines within the vector. It will not be an option for filled shapes. So when in the Inkscape file, rather than creating the shape filled with a color, we can turn off the fill and instead turn on the stroke. You can see how the stroke line just traces around the edge of this shape. Back in Artistic Digitizer, you can see that this stroke line presents us with a bunch of new stitch types. Running stitch uses the stitches in a path to draw that line. Another one you might be interested in trying is satin serial. It also creates straight lines, but it is a little bit thicker and it extrapolates a tiny satin stitch line from the stroke. Next, we will address stitch flow. You can see, for example, how all of the stitches in the orange color are flowing in this direction. If we wanted them to flow in a different direction, for example, we could select the Stitch Flow tool from the toolbar on the left, and we could change the stitch flow by clicking and dragging this line into the orientation that we'd like the stitches to follow. Sometimes the embroidery machine does a more efficient job in certain directions than others, so trusting the default orientation is usually optimized. This is another great reason to create a prototype before moving on to your good copy. The prototype will help you see which stitch patterns and stitch flow look the best on your design. The final simple tool that we will be reviewing in this video is the lettering tool. This tool allows us to add and alter custom text elements in our design. When incorporating text into your embroidery, I recommend using the text tool within Artistic Digitizer. That's because the software will then acknowledge that it is a piece of text rather than just a shape, and it approaches the stitches slightly differently to prioritize its legibility. If we were to upload this as a shape, it would still likely look fine, but we would have a better chance of getting really crisp letters by inserting text components at this stage. You can apply any font that is installed on the computer. So if there's a particular font you have in mind, you can download it in advance, and then we can select it as an option from this dropdown. You can see in this lower menu, it shows us the different colors included in the design. If we wanted to switch a color, we can right-click on it and then select Edit Color to choose the new color from the color wheel. The lower row shows the filled shapes, and the upper row shows any stroke lines. I'm pretty happy with how this is looking right now, so after we look it over one more time and double check its selected stitch types, we can save it onto the USB thumb drive. You can do that by selecting Save As or Export under File in the Artistic Digitizer toolbar. If you plug the USB into the computer while Digitizer is already open, it will prompt you with a pop-up that reads, "Embroidery files found on the named drive. Do you want to see them in browser?" Just click No, because we are saving onto the USB, not opening files from it. We will select the destination as our USB thumb drive. On it, there will be a folder called EMB, and within that, a subfolder EMBF. We have to store the files within this subfolder or the Janome cannot correctly find them. We will give it a title. When we search for it on the Janome, it displays them alphabetically, so remembering the file name can help us find it quickly. And then we're going to change the file format. The default format for Artistic Digitizer is a .draw. The .draw is your working file, so for example, if you want to be able to come back to this design and change the stitching types, positioning, or size, you will want to save a .draw version. Then, if we want to save a version onto our USB that is compatible with the embroidery machine, we're going to change this format from a .draw to either .jef or .jpx. Either one of these two formats are recognizable to the Janome and contain the stitching instructions. Once saved, it will tell you how many stitches make up the design. Less than 5,000 is usually a pretty quick embroidery. From there, we want to check if our file made it onto the USB. Go to the Finder, open up the USB, look within EMB or EMBF, and we should be able to find it there. Make sure to select Eject for that USB before you pull it out of the computer. This has been a quick introductory look at using Artistic Digitizer to create embroidery files. There are plenty of other awesome and more highly detailed tutorials here on YouTube for the nuances of using this software. We hope that this has given you the confidence to create your own design. Thank you for taking the time to watch this independent learning tutorial. We look forward to working with you in the Makerspace.